Hello and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now, when it comes to GCSE poetry, not only is it super challenging when it comes to knowing all the poems that you need to understanding the poet's message, trying to figure out what the poems are trying to say, but on top of that, literally translating what you understand in terms of the poem into an actual essay that shows you are able to analyze, you understand the poet's message, can be really, really challenging. And in fact, when it comes to GCSE English literature, one of the biggest weaknesses that teachers and examiners see with poetry essays is students simply don't know how to analyze poetry. So what I want to do is to show you within this very brief video how to easily analyze any GCSE poem in 3 easy steps. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one specific poem from AQA's Power and Conflict anthology collection just to illustrate the example of how to do this. But to be honest, these steps can be followed for any poem, okay? So if you're doing Love and Relationships AQA or EdXL Poetry, IGCSE, whichever poems, these steps are just equally as useful and relevant regardless of your syllabus, okay? So I want to show you, if you struggle with analyzing poetry, right? So it's already hard enough when you read the poem, it's kind of vague, and then trying to figure out what the poem is saying, and then applying this to an exam question or a practice question. How do you analyze? This is exactly how to do so, okay? And I'm going to show you how to apply this in 3 very easy steps. Now, the first thing when it comes to GCSE poetry is remember that in the poetry that you look at, in the different poems that you look at, the poet is always revealing, illustrating, and talking about a big idea. In other words, when you read any poem, you always generally find that the poem is either about love or conflict or war or the beauty of nature. There's always an idea that runs throughout the poem. Your job is to ensure when you first are approaching this question or whichever question you're given for poetry, when you look at the question and then you select whichever poem you want to talk about or the 2 poems you want to compare, first, decide what big idea the poet is trying to explore in the poem or poems that you're talking about. And what you need to do, the moment you do this, you move from slipping into describing the poem and going straight into what the poet is trying to say about life, about people, and about society. Okay, so one of the things that really holds students back when doing really well in poetry is they always slip into describing, oh, this poem is about this, and this is what happens in the poem, and here's some quotes, and this is what else happens in the poem. They slip into describing rather than taking a step back, because your teachers don't want you to describe what the poem is. They've read the same poem, right? You need to be able to take a step back and think, what is the big grand idea that the poet is trying to say, and how does this relate to maybe an idea relating to life, relating to people, and relating to society. Now, as I said, I'm going to give an example taken from the Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. This is AQA's Poetry Anthology, arguably the most popular anthology of set poems across the UK. And in Power and Conflict and in this collection, there are 4 big ideas that the 15 poets in this collection explore. And these are nature, war, identity, and memory. And I'm going to really specifically now zoom in on one particular poem. It's called Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. And specifically in this poem, say for example, you're writing about this poem, right? And perhaps comparing it to another poem. The big idea that's explored in this poem when you're analyzing, if you decide to analyze this poem, for example, is how nature, big idea, outlasts human achievement, okay? That's step number 1. Move away from describing what the poem is about and go straight into figuring out what big idea is the poet trying to convey through this poem, then talk about that, okay? And of course, if you're doing Power and Conflict, a really great example of this would be Ozymandias and how it explores the power of nature, which outlasts all of human achievement. But you don't stop there in analyzing any GCSE poem, because in step number 2, you need to then go one step further and quote from the poem, and then in the quotation that you selected, right, to say, for example, in the case of Ozymandias, you know, nature is being used to show how it outlasts human achievement. You select a quotation from the poem and then zoom in and mention and label the poet's use of either language techniques or structure techniques. By the way, if you're not clear on what language and structure means, Language is stuff like simile, alliteration, sibilance, personification, oxymoron, while structure is to do with, for example, is it written in a sonnet? Is it written in 4-line stanzas? Is there caesura? Is there enjambment? Again, if you're not clear on the difference between language and structure, I'd like to suggest please watch my really brief video where I talk about the top 10 language and structure techniques. It's on YouTube. Just literally watch that to just refresh your memory on those techniques and the relevant terminology. However, in step 2, when you're writing about poetry and analyzing, right, you've identified the big idea. Now you quote and then zoom in on whether the poet is using language or structure, and then mention this is how the poet communicates this big idea. For example, I'm now going to go one step further into Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. For instance, one of the quotations and a really powerful quote that he uses is to talk about how the lone and level sands stretch far away into the distance. These are the sands that have toppled the statue of King Ramesses II or King Ozymandias, right? Now, this quotation uses alliteration to demonstrate how nature erases human achievement, okay? Again, if you see so far in my 2 steps, I have not at any stage gone into describing what a poem is about, what happens in a poem. I've gone straight into talking about the poet's big ideas, then selecting a quotation and then labeling it, whether the writer has used language or structure, then talking about the effect of that. How does it demonstrate the subject terminology or the matter that they're talking about? The subject in Ozymandias being this king who thinks he is indestructible. And then finally, step number 3 is always mention context. What influenced the poet at the time to write about this? Again, this is something that lots of students tend to forget about and they tend to underestimate in terms of how this is really important in conveying the poet's message, but also in adding to their analysis. Remember that the moment you start talking about and mentioning either historical events or figures that influence the poet when they were writing the poem, that is now showing a really solid understanding of the poem. This is also showing that you're analyzing the use of language, the use of specific images, and why the poet used it. The moment you start mentioning, okay, this is, X event happened at the time that this poet was writing, or this is about this particular individual, the moment you start mentioning that and mentioning context, immediately you are going into analysis. And by the way, if you're doing Power and Conflict, because obviously I'm using Power and Conflict as my example, I'm going to be running a one-off October half-term Power and Conflict masterclass, okay? This is going to be on the week of half-term from the 27th all the way to the 2nd of November. And in my special one-off Power and Conflict GCSE masterclass, I'm going to not only be going over how to apply this in a model answer, but also you will not only have a cheat sheet on all 15 poems in Power and Conflict, but of course in that live lesson, you can ask me as many questions as you want. And in the GCSE grade 9 model answer that I write, you can use that for your revision for your upcoming mocks. So of course, you're very welcome to sign up. Now, I'm going to give an example of how you can apply step number 3 to Ozymandias. In other words, this poem specifically mocks a guy called King Ramesses or Pharaoh Ramesses II, who really constructed this statue thinking that he would always be remembered and feared for the rest of time. And of course, nature ultimately destroyed this statue. Tiny grains of sand destroyed and damaged this statue. And in terms of context, what Shelley was trying to demonstrate with this poem is how kings are not immortal and nature will always outlast human achievement, okay? And that's really it in terms of analyzing any GCSE poem in 3 simple and easy steps.